Thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you here today. It's a real pleasure and honor to join you and to see if I can help set the stage for this important dialogue. I want to begin by commending Award for launching this really bold and much needed initiative. GASP, as Susan just outlined it, really is so timely and it's so strategic. And it's really, GASP is to, Award really, I really commend you for that. It comes at a time when African agri-food systems are under enormous pressure, real intense pressure. When the demand for thoughtful, responsive, and implementable policy is rising. It's a real heavy demand for that. Over the past 2 decades, we have made important progress in recognizing that inclusive food systems are essential for Africa's development. The Kampala-Kadab Declaration gives clear voice to this recognition. As you know, it has 6 strategic objectives. All of these are really coherent and forward-looking. It really is an extraordinary statement of intent and commitment. But today I want to focus particularly on 2 of these objectives. The objective on inclusion, resilience, and gender equality, and the cross-cutting objective on governance and accountability. These objectives compel us to go beyond rhetorical commitments and to grapple seriously and very intentionally with the policy and institutional reforms needed to deliver results. So in that spirit, I would like to offer 3 propositions or 3 emerging priorities for your consideration as you begin this series of dialogues. Now, these are not definitive answers, they're my perspective, but I would suggest that they are maybe helpful points of entry for deeper engagement. The first priority is that we need to reframe inclusion as a productivity and structural transformation agenda. As I listened to Susan, it was very clear that that spirit, that idea is fundamental to GASP. So this is not news in that respect, but it really is an important priority because it hasn't been fully seized. The Kadab Declaration calls for inclusion, gender inclusion, other types of inclusion, and most of us instinctively interpret this as a social or rights-based concern. But inclusion is also very fundamentally a productivity concern and a structural challenge. The reality is that Africa's agri-food systems remain bifurcated. On one side are modernizing segments, integrated value chains, commercial hubs, medium-scale farms, dynamic, moving. On the other side are the low productivity zones, where exclusion is concentrated among women farmers, youth subsistence producers, and remote rural households. But fundamentally, I would say, really among women, because they cut across all of these groups. The emerging policy priority here is to shift from thinking about inclusion as a target group issue to understanding it as a structural imperative. Inclusion must be built into the design of transformation pathways. This means policies and investments must do 2 things simultaneously. First, expand and deepen the modern segments of the food system. We've got to do that. And second, create on-ramps for excluded groups to connect to these segments on fair and functional terms. This has direct implications for public spending. It means, for instance, that subsidies and incentives must be recalibrated to support equitable access to productive assets, not just aggregate output growth. Public goods investments, especially in things like irrigation, storage, rural connectivity, must be rebalanced to reach marginalized zones and actors, not just competitive value chains. Skills and services, from extension to financial literacy, must be designed to enable mobility, not lock people into static roles. This is not simply about scaling up smallholder support. We hear that a lot, right? It's more than that. It's about targeted transformation, where inclusion, gender inclusion, other forms of inclusion, is pursued not only as a fairness goal, but as productivity enhancing and economy-wide growth strategy. So that's the first priority. The second priority I would suggest is that we need to invest in institutions that are capable of delivering inclusion at scale, not just designing policy. Inclusion is not achieved through policy design alone. It requires institutional readiness, the capacity to deliver complex, cross-cutting, and context-specific interventions in the real world. Now, this is where many well-intentioned strategies falter. We have policies that read well, but are fragmented across ministries, poorly resourced, and inconsistently implemented. We need to face this question very clearly. Do our institutions have the mandate, the capacity, and the incentive to implement inclusion as a strategic objective? Is that explicit? So I would suggest that there are some emerging priorities here that fall into three categories: coordination, decentralization, and accountability and learning. So on coordination, inclusive food system policy touches agriculture, health, education, finance, social protection, and trade. Yet, sectoral silos persist. Sectoral silos are the norm. An emerging solution is the development, for instance, of cross-sectoral delivery mechanisms, such as interministerial task forces. I think Anne Chele will remember some of those that have been tried here in Kenya, or planning units tied to the office of the presidency or prime minister. So these are some of the things that are being attempted. But really what they're trying to do there is to address this cross-sectoral imperative. Now, these mechanisms need legal authority, budgetary weight, and political backing. So oftentimes they're there, but they don't have these other elements to them. So that's on coordination. On decentralization, now we have to understand, or at least make clear, that inclusion happens locally. Right? Gender-sensitive agricultural extension, market infrastructure, nutrition programs are all executed at local level. But decentralization without financial autonomy and financing is merely deconcentration. Local governments and subnational agencies must be empowered and resourced, to deliver, adapt, and respond. So that's the second area. And the third one that I'd like to suggest is on accountability and learning. And this is perhaps the most neglected area. We need institutions that can listen, learn, and course correct. And I think, again, listening to what Susan was describing, that seems to be one underneath what GASP is trying to do. Trying to build, enhance that platform for listening, learning, and course correction. Now, this requires monitoring systems that are disaggregated, feedback loops that are taken seriously, and mechanisms for civil society, especially women's organizations, to have voice and influence in shaping program implementation. In sum, institutional reform is not an administrative exercise. It's central to inclusion, it's central to gender inclusion. And the emerging policy priority is to move from project-based experimentation to system-level investment in institutional capability. Again, fundamental to what you're trying to hear. The third priority is that I think we need to rethink how evidence is generated and used in policy. And again, especially around inclusion and gender inclusion. There is no shortage of data on gender disparities in agriculture. I think our colleague from GIZ actually really very articulated mentioned some of them. But too often, our analytical frameworks remain siloed, technocratic, and inattentive to the actual levers of change. the emerging challenge is not to just generate more data, but to rethink how we frame the evidence that shapes policy decisions. I think there are three shifts to consider: from averages to heterogeneity, from evaluation to learning, and from donor-driven diagnostics to decision-driven evidence. So regarding moving from averages to heterogeneity, too many policy decisions are based on national averages that obscure variation by gender, by geography, and by class. Disaggregated data are essential, but not sufficient. We need analytical tools that reveal how policy instruments perform differently across contexts, and that allow us to model trade-offs and synergies with gendered outcomes in mind. This is really, really key, I think. Regarding moving from evaluation to learning, our traditional impact assessments ask what worked. The fuller question, I would suggest, is what worked for whom, under what conditions, and why? So that story that our colleague from GIZ mentioned, buried in there are some of these, the kind of questions that we need to get at. So this calls for mixed methods approaches, embedded researches, and adaptive learning frameworks built into program cycles. And with respect to moving from donor-driven diagnostics to decision-driven evidence, many gender and inclusion studies are produced for accountability to donors. There's no doubt about that, not for action by governments. The emerging priority is to embed evidence generation in the policy process. That's what is behind a lot of what we're trying to do. Co-created with public officials and implementers, and timed to decision cycles. All of this is not easy, but I think with the kind of energy and imagination captured by GASP, I think it is doable, and it is necessary, because inclusion cannot be driven by ideology or inertia. It must be guided by rigorous, relevant, and relational knowledge. Fortunately, we are not starting from scratch, so I've come back to the point about the Kampala Declaration. This gives us a powerful mandate, a rallying cry, a common reference point. What we must do now is translate that mandate into action with realism, precision, and ambition. So to summarize my proposed priorities, first, we must treat inclusion not as an add-on, but as a core dimension of structural transformation and productivity policy. Second, we must build institutions capable not just of designing inclusive policy, but of delivering it, learning from it, and sustaining it. And third, we must reshape our evidence ecosystems to guide decisions that reflect the complexity of gender inclusion in food systems. The GASP initiative is well placed to lead this conversation and to help shape the next generation of policy and institutional reform across Africa. I look